Hello, this is Dr. Gwen Fisher in Psychology 440, Industrial Psychology. This is part of Module 15, Ethics in Industrial Psychology. And in particular, this is Module 15.2, Ethics in Working with Organizations. By now, you should have already read the APA document with the ethical principles and code of conduct for psychologists. If you have not already completed this reading, please stop this slideshow right now and go back, do the reading simply because it'll help make everything we're going to be talking about in Module 15.2 make a lot more sense. Thank you. Moving on to talk about the agenda. There are a couple things we're going to do here. First of all, we're going to I'll provide a definition of ethics and describe the importance of ethics. In other words, why are we even considering this topic in this course? And then more specifically, we'll review some specific aspects of the American Psychological Association ethical principles and standards. There are a few objectives for Module 15.2. In particular, I hope that you understand what ethics is and why it's important. Secondly, understand how ethics is relevant to industrial psychology. Why are we spending time talking about this? And lastly, you should be able to identify key ethical principles that are important for understanding work behavior and people in organizations. Whoops. All right, here is just a little cartoon to further convey the importance. You may imagine a situation where there is pressure on an organizational psychologist to make a decision that might benefit a company, but where good moral behavior is not necessarily rewarded. Sometimes there might be pressure for results in work to come out a certain way. There might be pressure to hire somebody, or all kinds of things that could impact decisions that IO psychologists might make. Okay, here is a list of 5 key ethical principles as put forth by the American Psychological Association. You read about these in detail in the document that was available on Canvas, but just to describe and review briefly. Principles of beneficence and non-maleficence indicate simply that psychologists should really aim to help people and should definitely avoid to doing any harm. Fidelity and responsibility is an important principle with regard to the nature of relationships that we establish with people. Psychologists should establish relationships of trust, and they should be aware of both their professional and scientific responsibilities with their clients and in society as a whole. Principles of integrity indicate that it's absolutely critical to be accurate, honest, and truthful in the work that we do. This includes in our research, in our teaching, and in our practice of psychology. We should definitely not steal, cheat, or engage in any fraud, or intentionally misrepresent any facts. The 4th ethical principle is justice. Simply what we're striving for is fairness and justice for everybody with whom we work, that everybody should have equal access to and be able to benefit from the contributions of psychology. And there should be equal quality in the processes, procedures, and services that psychologists conduct. In other words, we really need to be fair and treat everyone fairly. The 5th and last ethical principle is respect for people's rights and dignity. According to the APA ethical principles, psychologists should respect the dignity and worth of all people, as well as respect the rights of individuals' privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. Data with which we work should be held privately and confidentiality. We should not violate that trust. We should take, wherever possible, safeguards to protect the rights and welfare of everybody. And psychologists should be aware of and respect cultural, individual, and role differences among people. just like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act indicates a number of protected groups with regard to employment decisions, like gender, race, national origin, and so forth. We should definitely treat everyone fairly with regard to and with respect to these individual differences. In addition to these 5 key ethical principles, a number of ethical standards put forth in the documents as well. The first one is resolving ethical issues. For example, if we learn that our work has been misused or misrepresented in any way, we should do our best to absolutely resolve this issue and resolve this work. Competence pertains to the notion that psychologists should only do work that they are qualified to do. For example, as somebody trained in industrial organizational psychology, I am not a clinician nor a counseling psychologist. Therefore, it would be completely inappropriate for me to practice outside the bounds of my competence and serve in the role of counseling somebody who's dealing with some individual personal issues. Similarly, somebody who does not have formal training and proper skills regarding industrial organizational psychology should not market themselves or their skills as being able to help organizations with assessment and measurement or the application of certain scales and so forth in the work that we do. With regard to human relations, what we want to avoid are things like unfair discrimination, sexual harassment, and we want to, along with the principle of non-maleficence, we want to avoid any harm. We also want to be careful about engaging in multiple relationships. For example, we need to make sure that if we are consulting for one particular organization, that we could end up in a conflict situation if a competitor were to hire us as well. And we need to just be aware of engaging in multiple professional relationships. Related to this, we need to avoid conflicts of interest as well. In other words, not to take on a professional role if there's a personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interest that could somehow impair our ability to do the right thing and to make the best judgments and assessments possible. I already spoke about privacy and confidentiality. This is absolutely critical as we often work with very sensitive data, so we need to put a lot of procedures and steps in place to maintain privacy and confidentiality. Another ethical standard pertains to advertising. We want to avoid false or deceptive statements with regard to what we are doing, either on a paid or an unpaid basis. Additional ethical standards include maintaining proper records and charging appropriate fees for what we do. With regard to education and training, going back to competence, making sure that we are properly educated and trained for the work that we're doing. We also are responsible for education and training programs that take reasonable steps to ensure that these programs are appropriate and that they meet the requirements that might be stipulated. So for example, if in clinical and counseling psychology, many psychologists can be licensed. It's possible, depending on the state in which you live, that you might become a licensed professional in industrial organizational psychology and that you would have to go through the proper education and training. A lot of what we do involves assessment, so that is another critical ethical standard as well. We've talked about that previously, so it's basically applying everything that you've already learned in terms of proper assessment and using tools that establish reliability and validity. Therapy is not particularly relevant to us in IO psychology, but it goes back to the notion that we are not qualified to conduct therapy, so that's something that we should not be. So that concludes the review of the APA ethical guidelines. The next thing we're going to do in module 15.3 is apply this ethics information to some case studies.